The first thing investigators could still clearly describe was what he was wearing: red jeans, a hooded pullover with light gray plaid body and darker blue sleeves, brown Timberland boots tied in double knots, not loosely tied, slipped on, double knotted. The way your mom might tie your shoes before sending you out in the world, afraid that they may come loose and you won't know how to retie them. But this child was not found on a playground or at a school. He was not found waiting for someone to come back. He was found in the woods near a church cemetery in DeKalb County, Georgia. And for more than 20 years, nobody knew his name. This is a case that begins with a little boy no one could identify, a cemetery outside Atlanta, and a mystery that sat unanswered for more than 2 decades. This is a case of William Deshaun Hamilton. For years, he was described by the place where he was found, the clothes he was wearing, and the name investigators used when they did not have his real one: Clifton John Doe. Some called him Dennis because calling the child John Doe over and over again felt cold, too cold. To understand our story, we must go back to Georgia in 1999. February 26, 1999, in DeKalb County, Georgia, just outside Atlanta, workers near Clifton United Methodist Church and its cemetery were doing the kind of routine that probably felt ordinary at first. This was not supposed to become the beginning of a decade-long case. It was supposed to be another day. But while checking the area near the cemetery, a worker noticed something in a wooded area nearby. What he found were skeletal remains. Very quickly, it became clear these were not the remains of an adult. They belonged to a child, a little boy. Investigators came to the scene, and right away they were facing a terrible question. Who was he? The child's body was badly decomposed. Some descriptions say skeletal, some say partly mummified. Either way, he had been there long enough that investigators could not simply look at him and know what had happened. Time, weather, exposure, and animals can change a scene so much that the truth becomes harder and harder to read. But there were still clues. He was wearing red jeans. He had on a hooded pullover that appeared to have a light gray plaid or checkered body, with darker blue sleeves and a matching darker hood. And on his feet, there were brown Timberland boots. He was a black male child. That clothing gave investigators somewhere to start, but it didn't give them a name. There were other details too, and they made the mystery more complicated. Investigators believe the child appeared to have been cared for. He was not malnourished. He still had some of his baby teeth. His estimated age at the time was roughly between 4 and 7, and ultimately, they eventually identified him as 6. Those details were important, but also muddied the water because there was no easy assumption. This was not a case where investigators could look at the body and immediately say the child had been neglected for years. The evidence pointed to a little boy who had been dressed, who had shoes on his feet, who had likely been in someone's care, and who still somehow ended up outside near a cemetery with no adult coming forward to say his name. At first, law enforcement thought they might be able to identify him quickly. He was young. He was dressed. He had recognizable clothing. Surely, somewhere, there was a missing child report they could turn to. Or there was someone calling the police saying their little boy was gone. And certainly there was a grandmother, an aunt, a teacher, a neighbor, somebody saying, I haven't seen him in a while. But That didn't happen. Investigators started with what they had. They looked at the clothing, they tried to trace the boots, they checked missing child databases, they compared him to reports from Georgia and beyond. They looked at cases from across the country. Nothing matched. The Timberland boots were a lead, but not the kind that gives you a name. Investigators were able to narrow the distribution only broadly. The boots had been sold across a large region east of the Mississippi River. Now, that sounds helpful until you realize how many states, cities, malls, and stores, and ultimately families that covers. It did not pinpoint to one household or one parent. And all of those missing child reports, it didn't point them in a direction either. It was just another clue that faded into a much bigger map. The medical side of the case was also frustrating. An autopsy could not determine the cause of death. There were traces of acetaminophen and diphenhydramine in his remains, both common in over-the-counter medications. Acetaminophen is often used for pain or fever. Diphenhydramine is an antihistamine, often associated with allergy medicines or sleepiness. So investigators had to ask some questions. What did these medications mean? It could mean he was sick, or maybe someone was trying to help him, or had something gone wrong before he was left in the woods. Those questions made a clear answer difficult. There was also evidence of injury, including reported fractures around the skull, face area. But again, investigators had to be careful. When a body has been outside for months, fractures can happen before death, around the time of death, or after death because of environmental factors or animal activity. That meant law enforcement could not say with certainty how the child died. They could not even say definitively whether it was a homicide. But the circumstances were suspicious enough that the case was handled seriously, and the homicide division became involved because even without a cause of death, there was still the reality of where he was found. A small child does not just end up decomposed in the woods near a cemetery by himself. Someone knew him, had been responsible for him, and had not come forward. The community was devastated by a child being found in a cemetery unidentified, and they did everything they could to help. A local church helped with funeral arrangements. Investigators reportedly attended and photographed the funeral, looking for anyone whose behavior seemed suspicious or unusually emotional. It's one of those investigative details that sounds almost like something from a movie, well, because it is, but it also makes sense in reality. Sometimes the person connected to a death will show up because of guilt, curiosity, fear, or they might come back to the burial. But if the person who knew this child came to that funeral, they did not reveal themselves in a way that solved this case. So this little boy was buried without his name. This child became known as Clifton John Doe because of where he was found and not knowing his name. And later, because investigators hated the coldness of that, he was also called Dennis. Dennis was not his name, but was a way for people to talk about him like a child instead of an object. The years began to pass. 1999 became 2000, 2001, 2005, then 2010. Technology changed, DNA testing improved, missing person databases grew. Cold case work changed dramatically across the country. But for this case, the answer still didn't come. It's important to understand DNA testing was part of a larger cold case world by then, but it was not the kind of tool it is today. Investigators could not simply upload a profile, build a family tree, and identify an unknown child through forensic genealogy the way some agencies can now. The science, the database, and the public genealogy infrastructure had not evolved enough to make DNA the answer in William's case at the time. There were tips, possible matches. There were moments where investigators hoped a lead might be. One strange tip reportedly came in 1999. A caller claimed to know who the child was and gave them Cable Brown. But investigators were not able to connect that name to a missing child who matched the boy in Georgia. That's part of what makes unidentified child cases so difficult. Investigators are not trying to solve a death, they're trying to reconstruct an entire life from fragments. A shirt, a pair of jeans, a boot brand, an age range, a possible injury, medications. Every detail is important, but none of those details can speak by itself. It's part of this bigger picture where you have to quite literally put the pieces of the puzzle together. Investigators also tried to give the public a face to remember. Before the later digital style reconstruction, there was an earlier clay figure. A three-dimensional depiction created an effort to show what the unidentified child might have looked like in life. It wasn't perfect, and if you're watching this on Spotify or on YouTube, you see it wasn't perfect, baby. And no reconstruction is, although I say in this case, that's debatable as we will see later, because the reconstruction that they did digitally was a 10 out of 10, a match for sure, right on. But what this reconstruction did, it gave people something more human than just measurements or the clothing or an age range. The public saw the reconstruction. They had something to identify this unknown child. Investigators saw a file that kept refusing to close, and somewhere there should have been an absence that matched him. A school desk, a bedroom, a relative asking questions, a neighbor wondering why a child was no longer around, but nothing connected in a way investigators needed it to. So the case stayed open, but quiet. And quiet is dangerous for cold cases, not because investigators stopped caring, but because the public stopped seeing the person. A child can become a sketch passed around every few years, a case anniversary, a short local news segment, a reminder at the bottom of a missing persons page. Then the world moves again. For the people still working the case, the question stayed the same. Someone knew this little boy before the woods, so who was he? Still, the case did not disappear completely. It resurfaced through investigators, local reporters, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and people who understood that a child's identity can sometimes come back through repetition. Show the face again, tell the details over, ask the public to help. Then came 2019. 20 years had passed since the discovery. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children created an updated forensic reconstruction of what the boy might have looked like in life. This is important because reconstructions are not just artwork. They are an investigative tool. They take the skull structure, age estimate, ancestry, and other forensic details and try to create an image that might trigger recognition. The first image of an unidentified person might not reach the right person, or it might not look enough like them, or the right person might not be ready to understand what they are seeing. But a new image can change everything. Fox 5 Atlanta covered the anniversary. The report included the clothing details, red jeans, the hooded pullover with light patterned body and darker blue sleeves, and the brown Timberland boots. It included the timeline and the fact the boy had been found near the cemetery February 26, 1999. It reminded the public that investigators still did not know his name. That report went out into the world as another plea for help. For investigators, it was the same question they had carried since 1999. Who is this child? But somewhere else, someone had been carrying a different question. Where is William? Ava McNeil had known a little boy named William Deshaun Hamilton. She knew his mother, Teresa Ann Bailey Black, from Charlotte, North Carolina, and William was not a passing face to her. He was a child she had spent time with, a child who had been close enough to remember. Ava remembered him as sweet, loving, and full of life. A&E reporting described William as a curious child who loved encyclopedias. Ava also said he had known her family since he was about a year old and that her family would sometimes help Teresa by watching him. That one detail changes the emotional temperature of the case. William was not invisible. Ava's family had known him for years, and his father, William Harris Hamilton, was still alive decades later to speak at sentencing. The public record does not tell us everything about his life in Charlotte. It doesn't clearly establish his exact neighborhood, school history, neighbors, memories, or the full shape of his relationship with his mother or father before he vanished. But it tells us enough to know he had people who knew his face, his voice, his presence before the cemetery, before the forensic sketches, and before the trial. William was a little boy whose life had already touched other people. He had birthdays. He had adults who remembered him clearly enough to know when his absence didn't feel right. That's why Ava's memory was important. William was not a case file to her. He was a child who she recognized, a child whose life in Charlotte stayed with her long after the world in Georgia knew him only as unidentified. According to later reporting, in December of 1998, Teresa told Ava she was leaving Charlotte and going to Atlanta with William. That was the last time Ava saw him. Think about that goodbye. At the time, Ava didn't know she was saying goodbye for forever. She didn't know that this would become a question she carried for decades. Teresa later returned without William, and that's where Ava's concern began to grow. When someone leaves with a child and comes back without said child, that absence feels odd, and it speaks for itself. The answers Ava received reportedly changed over time. When explanations shift, people remember. They may not be able to prove anything based on the shifting explanations, but something in them starts keeping score. So Ava searched online and made phone calls, and for years she searched as though William might be alive. She checked places where people might show up if they were separated from their families. She looked through records, shelters, phone books, and agencies. In her mind, William kept aging. He would have become a teenager, a young man, then an adult. Year after year, William aged in Ava's mind. She was holding on to hope. She wasn't searching for an unidentified child in Georgia. She was searching for a living person who might have grown up somewhere else. Maybe he was in another state. Maybe there was some version of the story where the answer was painful but not fatal. At the same time, investigators in Georgia were looking at the case from the other direction. They had a child who had already died, but no family. Ava had a child she remembered, but no confirmation that he was gone. Those two searches existed side by side for years without touching. That's a painful irony. The case was not cold because nobody cared. It was cold because the people with the pieces did not know they were holding the pieces of the same story. Investigators had the place where William was found. Ava had the memory of who had been. For more than 2 decades, those pieces stayed separate. Then Ava saw the updated image of the unidentified boy from DeKalb County. She looked at the image and she recognized him. Investigators took the tip serious. Ava recognized the reconstruction. She contacted authorities. Investigators followed the lead. In 2022, authorities announced that the boy found near the cemetery in 1999 was 6-year-old William Deshaun Hamilton. That identification changed the direction of the case. Investigators now had a family, a city, a timeline, and people who remembered William before the woods. It also meant people who had loved him were receiving 2 truths at once. The first truth was that the search had an answer. The second was that the answer was devastating. William had not been living somewhere else. He had not grown into a teenager Ava imagined, then the young man she hoped might one day be found. He died as a child. It also changed the emotional center of the investigation. The case no longer began with remains found near a cemetery. It began with a child who lived in North Carolina, who had been taken to Atlanta, and whose disappearance had troubled someone for years. Once William was identified, the question shifted from who is he to how did he get here? Once investigators knew who he was, they turned to the person who had last been known to have him, his mother. Teresa Ann Bailey Black. By then, Teresa was living in Arizona. Detectives went to speak with her, and the interview became one of the turning points in the case. At first, according to the accounts of that interview, Teresa did not immediately mention Georgia when she talked about the places she lived. She spoke about other states, including Alaska, North Carolina, but Georgia was not the first thing she offered. When asked about her children, she reportedly mentioned a daughter, but not William, not right away, and not because she offered it. Investigators already knew why they were there. They were there trying to understand how a 6-year-old boy from her life ended up unidentified in Georgia. Eventually, though, they told Teresa they were from DeKalb County. They asked about William. Teresa's first claim was she left William with a woman she met at a homeless shelter. According to her account, this woman was supposed to help take care of him while Teresa got back on her feet. Investigators needed more than that, though. They wanted to know who this woman was, where William had supposedly gone, and why Teresa had never been able to produce him. The first explanation placed William somewhere out in the world, alive but unreachable. It also shifted responsibility away from Teresa and onto an unnamed woman. Investigators could not immediately verify. For a case that had already lost more than 20 years, a vague story like this wasn't enough for investigators. So they challenged her story. They showed her the image connected to the case. They told her William had died in 1999. And Teresa's account changed. She said she and William had been homeless in Atlanta. She said they were sleeping outside from park to park, and he was sick. She claimed she gave him medicine, and then at some point they went to sleep. She woke up, but he didn't. That part of the story needs more context. But we know that sometimes people negate context for a convenient excuse. Now, public reporting does not establish exactly where Teresa and William slept in Atlanta, whether they tried to enter a shelter or a shelter turned them away, or whether anyone saw them on the street. So I want to be careful that we don't really know what took place. We only have Teresa's account. What I can say is that Atlanta in the late 1990s was a major city with visible homelessness, limited shelter space, and growing public conversation about people sleeping outside. February in Atlanta is not northern winter, but it's still winter. Average lows sit near the upper 30s and low 40s, and cold rain can make a night outside feel much harsher than the number alone suggests. Now, picture that with a 6-year-old who's sick. Now, I don't want you to reach a legal conclusion just yet, and I'm not trying to get you to decide guilt, but walk with me. This is just a reality check. A child that young does not manage fever, medication, hunger, cold, fear, and uncertainty on his own. He depends on an adult to decide when he needs a doctor, shelter, family, and when the situation has become an emergency. That's why Teresa's account raised so many questions. If William was sick enough to be given medication and then never woke up, why was there no call for help? Why was no hospital involved? Why not contact somebody in the family? And why did the truth, even according to her own later version, stay hidden for more than 20 years? She said she panicked and she didn't know what to do. So she left him there and eventually laid him to rest in that wooded area of the cemetery. Her version sounded like panic after an accidental death, a homeless mother, a sick child, over-the-counter medicine, a night outside, and a child who simply didn't wake up. But even that version left investigators with a hard reality. If Teresa's account was true, William died without medical help, without family being notified, and without anyone being given the chance to bury him as himself. If it was not true, then the story was covering something far worse. But prosecutors did not accept that as the full truth. The state believed Teresa was responsible not only for concealing William's death, but for causing it. Prosecutors alleged that Teresa gave William medication containing acetaminophen and diphenhydramine, failed to get him medical care, and struck him with an unknown object. They pointed to the fracture and the circumstances. They argued that she failed him in the most serious way. In 2022, Teresa Ann Bailey Black was indicted on 2 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of first-degree cruelty to children, aggravated assault, and concealing the death of another person. But a courtroom is a lot different than suspicion. A trial can be a different story. By the time Teresa went to trial in January of 2024, the state had a heavy burden. They had to prove the charges beyond a reasonable doubt, and this was not a fresh case. This was a case where the body had been outside for months before the discovery. The cause of death was still undetermined. The key events happened in early 1999, more than 2 decades earlier. That kind of time gap is brutal for a prosecution. Witnesses' memories fades, records disappear, people move, some people die. Physical evidence breaks down. A small uncertainty in 1999 can become a huge hole by 2024. The age of the case shaped almost everything jurors heard. They were not watching a clean timeline unfold with immediate medical findings, fresh witness statements, and a cause of death everyone agreed on. They were being asked to judge events that had happened before some evidence could be preserved, before some witnesses could be found, and before William even had his name in the case file. That did not make the case less painful. It made it harder to prove. That tension sat underneath the trial. On one side, there was the moral weight of a child left in the woods. On the other hand, there was the legal burden of proving exactly how he died and who caused it. Those two things can feel like they should lead to the same answer, but in court, they do not always line up. The prosecution's theory was that William did not just die naturally in his sleep. They argued that Teresa was responsible for his death through abuse, neglect, medication, and failure to seek help. They argued that she had people around her who would have taken William in if she could not care for him. They also stated that instead of calling for help and bringing him to family or taking him to the hospital, she left him in the woods. The state also focused on the concealment. Whatever jurors believed about the exact cause of death, William had been left in a wooded area and remained unidentified for more than 20 years. Prosecutors framed that as abandonment. They argued that William was discarded. The prosecution also emphasized that Teresa had options. Their argument was not only about the final night she described, but about the choices surrounding it, not seeking medical care, not contacting family, not telling authorities, and not giving the people who loved William the truth. But the defense had a different job. Their job was not to make Teresa look perfect. Their job was simply to create reasonable doubt about the most serious charges. The defense argued that the evidence did not prove murder, that William was sick, and Teresa gave him common over-the-counter medication. And then he died while he was asleep outside. They argued she panicked and made a terrible decision by not calling for help and by leaving his body. But that panic and concealment is not murder. The defense argument was essentially this: you can hate what she did afterward, but that does not prove she killed him. That argument did not ask jurors to approve of Teresa's choices. It asked them to separate what was proven from what was suspected. In a case with no definitive cause of death, that separation was extremely important. At trial, jurors heard about the investigation, the discovery, the identification, Teresa's statements to police after the incident, the medical uncertainty, and the years of silence. Fox 5 Atlanta reported that Ava McNeil was the first witness on the stand. That choice makes sense. Before jurors heard all the forensic uncertainty and legal argument, they first heard from someone who could say William had been a real child in a community before he was ever known as Clifton John Doe. The state called more than 20 witnesses before resting its case. Jurors heard from people connected to William, from investigators, and from experts whose testimony had to bridge a gap nearly 25 years later. They heard from William's father and family members. His father, William Harris Hamilton, had gone years without knowing what happened to his son. According to reporting, he had last seen William when William was around school age. Imagine living with uncertainty for that long and then finding out your child had been dead for decades. and not only dead, unidentified. A part of his claim on why he hadn't been in contact with William is because Teresa told him that she didn't want anything to do with him, and that included not seeing their son. The forensic testimony was difficult in a different way. The medical examiner could describe what was found and what could not be determined. The body had been outside too long, decomposition, exposure had taken away information that might have been available in a fresh case. The medication findings could be discussed, but they did not automatically answer whether the doses were fatal, accidental, therapeutic, or connected to the death at all. Reported fractures could be a part of the state's theory, but the age and condition of the remains made interpretation hard. That is why the phrase undetermined cause of death carries so much weight in this case. It was not a small technicality. It shaped the entire trial. The defense called one witness, a forensic pathologist who testified about the limits of the medical evidence. Fox 5 reported that after that, Teresa waived her right to testify, so jurors did not hear her tell the story from the stand. They heard her through statements investigators said she made, through the evidence, and through the arguments from both sides. In closing, prosecutors focused on the choices around William's death: the failure to seek help, the changing explanations, the body left in the woods, and the years William remained unidentified. The defense focused on what could not be proven: no definitive cause of death, no fresh medical scene, and no way to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Teresa caused William's death rather than panicked after it. After the verdict, Fox 5 spoke with jurors who said the physical evidence was limited. Jury foreman Samuel Logan described the physical evidence as limited at best. That's the kind of phrase that can frustrate people listening from the outside, but it also reveals what the jury room was wrestling with. They were not deciding whether William mattered, they were deciding what the state had proven under the law. And that becomes so important when we're talking about cases. The jury ultimately reached a split verdict. Teresa Ann Bailey Black was found not guilty of felony murder, not guilty of aggravated assault, and not guilty of child cruelty, but she was found guilty of concealing the death of another person. For some people, that verdict felt like too little. For others, it reflected the limits of the case built decades after William's body was found, with no definitive cause of death. On January 12, 2024, Teresa was sentenced to 10 years in prison for concealing William's death. That was the maximum sentence for that charge under Georgia's law. At sentencing, the judge made it clear that the concealment itself was devastating. Fox 5 Atlanta reported that Judge Stacey Hydrick said she could not fathom how a mother could leave her child in the woods. And she told Teresa there were so many other options. William's father asked for the maximum sentence. Ava also spoke about William and the love he had to give. Sentencing was one of the few public moments where people who loved William could speak about him in a courtroom and say clearly that he was important. Ava's presence was extremely important in this case. She had not let William disappear into a changed explanation or an unanswered absence. She kept the question alive long enough for the right image to reach her. The court case may have belonged to the state, but the identification began with memory. The case had a legal ending, but it still left behind questions the courtroom could not fully answer. There are still things we don't know. We do not know the definitive cause of death or exactly what happened in William's final hours. We don't know whether the medication in his system was given with care, desperation, neglect, or something worse. We don't know what William might have said if a safe adult had found him in time and asked him what he needed. What we do know is that William was 6 years old. 6 is losing teeth, learning to read, wanting snacks, asking questions, getting sleepy in the car, and still needing someone to hold your hand in unfamiliar places. 6 is young enough to believe adults know what they are doing, young enough to trust the person leading you somewhere, young enough that the world is still supposed to be explained to you, not survived alone. That is where this case should leave us. With William, not Teresa, with the little boy Ava remembered, with the child his father spent years wondering about, with the image from the beginning, shoes tied carefully, still on his feet when he was found. William's case also asks us to think beyond one courtroom. There are unidentified children in the country whose names still have not been restored. Their families still searching from one direction while investigators search from another. There are reconstructions, tips, old records, and new forensic tools that can matter years after a case goes quiet. Ava was not a detective, nor a forensic expert. She was an ordinary person like you and I, who remembered a child and refused to let the question disappear. In cold cases, this is what matters. A face reaches the right person, a memory connects to a file. A child who had been listed as unknown is finally spoken of by his name. Adults have histories, children have futures. And when a child dies, we are not only grieving what happened, we're grieving every birthday, every school year, every ordinary day, and every version of the person he never got the chance to become. William Deshaun Hamilton was found. He's remembered. His story did not end as a file marked unknown. Rest in peace, William. May you forever be remembered by those who truly loved you. That is our case for this week. I love to hear you guys' thoughts. I feel like I say this often, not every episode. I love when you leave comments, whether it's here on social media or you leave a comment on Spotify. I love interacting with you. I'm not that podcaster that says that and doesn't truly mean it. I always respond back to you guys, whether that's a heart or I tell you, girl, yes, or yeah, I'm with you, bro. I'm always engaging. And so I just want to encourage that collaboration together because that's how we build our community. And this case was a little different than what we've covered here on Murder in the Black. Usually we have covered the missing. It's very seldom that we cover the missing. They are unidentified. Plus, we're able to encapsulate the trial and thoroughly discuss it with one another. So let me know your thoughts about Teresa, more importantly about William, and just how this case unfolded. And if you're from Atlanta, I really want to hear from you because you probably remember this depending on your age range. Our true crime and current news segment was never intended to become a weekly feature. Now, this idea was something that I came up with in season 8. It was very transient. Didn't know if you guys liked it or not. But then as you guys started sending me articles of different cases that were occurring around you and on a national level, I knew this is something I wanted to keep. The basis of this segment was to talk about cases that are currently occurring as the updates roll in. I'll give you the update. But lately, there has been so much happening that we've ended up doing this segment almost every week for the past couple of episodes. We've been covering the Nolan Wells case. We've talked about it, but this week, the Jackson County District Attorney confirmed that the investigation into Nolan's death will be presented to a grand jury after the police have wrapped up their investigation. That's a significant step because a grand jury will now review the evidence and determine whether criminal charges should be filed. And another major development involves Nolan's cell phone. Nolan's family attorney, Ben Crump, and the district attorney's office have agreed to conduct a joint review of Nolan's phone after questions were raised about whether data had been deleted. Now, the goal is to make sure the evidence is examined transparently before the grand jury considers the case. Next update comes out of North Texas. On April 13th, 8-year-old Daniel Mike Irving left home with two friends believing he was going fishing at Lake Ray Hubbard. According to the investigators, the group instead went to the railroad bridge in Rowlett where they jumped into the water. Daniel never made it back home. After he failed to return, his family reported him missing the following day. Then on April 17th, his body was recovered from Lake Ray Hubbard. The Dallas County medical examiner ruled his death an accidental drowning. The case took a major turn on July 9th when police arrested 19-year-old Lucas Roper and a 17-year-old juvenile on charges of tampering with physical evidence. Investigators allege the teens discarded Daniel's clothing and cell phone, left the scene without calling 911, and deleted electronic evidence after his disappearance. It's important to note that no one has been charged in Daniel's death, and Dallas police continue to classify it as an accidental drowning. However, Daniel's family, represented by attorney Ben Crump, the same attorney for Nolan Wells, and he says that the arrests are only partial justice and continues to push for more extensive investigation into what happened that day. And they have their own private investigators to look into what occurred on the day of Daniel's death. Now, what's interesting is that while Daniel Irving's death happened before Nolan Wells, because it has garnered more national attention here in recent weeks because of Nolan Wells' case, there have been a lot of comparisons there. So I will continue to monitor both cases closely. Let me know what you think about the Daniel Irving case. That'll do it for this week. Until next time, this is Murder in the Black.